Hey, welcome to episode 126 of Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. Today I have a guest who's been a journalist in South Dakota for many years, and I'm just so excited to ask him more about the part of journalism we don't see as readers and take for granted, as well as how we discover more about the stories that impact our region and become more interested in where we live. I'll be back in a sec after this intro.
Today's guest, Steve Young.
Welcome back to Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. It's really great that you're here. Let me tell you a little bit about Steve Young. No, he's not a football player for the 49ers, at least not yet. Steve was born in Miller, South Dakota. He graduated from South Dakota State University in Brookings in 1979 with a Bachelor's of Arts degree in journalism. He worked for the Huron, South Dakota Daily Plainsman, the Brookings, South Dakota Register, and the Great Falls, Montana Tribune. In the Sioux Falls Argus Leader, his wife Sandy holds a master's degree in nursing and spent her career at Sanford Health. Together, Steve and Sandy have 3 children and count them, 8 grandchildren. Please help me welcome Steve Young.
Hey, Jason, great to be here.
Hey, thanks for coming on. Great to have you. I've been really excited for this discussion.
Well, I've watched a number of your episodes. You do a fantastic podcast, and I'm just happy to be part of the group of superstars you had on this program.
Cool. I love interviewing superstars and celebrating them.
You bet.
So let's start off. Go back in time a ways. If I had asked you at age 7, Steve, what do you want to be when you grow up? What would you have said?
You know, Jason, I don't know if it's unique about me or not, but yeah, I used to do these crazy things when I was a little kid. I used to write down license plate numbers, walk up and down the streets with my little notepad and copy that. I used to, when my family was on vacation, I might get lost in a cemetery writing down the names off of tombstones. My mom, we lived in Watertown for a while. My mom worked at a place called Park Grant, kind of a grocery wholesaler, and they had a newsletter there, and I had some poetry published in that newsletter when I, in fact, was 6 or 7 years old, and so I knew pretty early on that I wanted to be a writer when I grew up, and I think probably by the time I was 7 to 10 years old, I thought I was going to go into the newspaper world, or at least the magazine world.
What do you enjoy about the idea of writing for a newspaper?
You know, to be honest, I had some great teachers at both Huron High School, where I graduated, and at South Dakota State, who, as I worked in journalism, as I worked in creative writing, were very were very uplifting. They gave me a lot of praise. They seemed to indicate to me that my writing in whatever the classes was impactful to them. And so, I mean, I like the idea of doing something that people responded to and typically responded to in a positive way. So actually, in high school, I became a big Sports Illustrated fan, and Sports Illustrated back in the early to mid '70s had some tremendous writers, Frank Ford and Dan Jenkins and Kenny Moore. These guys wrote these long pieces on individual, and I mean the writing was just superb. And what I really wanted to do is go to work for Sports Illustrated. That was my life's ambition, was to go to work for Sports Illustrated. And so I worked for a couple of years in high school for the Huron Plainsman. I'd go out and cover Friday night football games. And then I went to college at SDSU, and I worked in the sports department there, covering all kinds of sports. And my dream all along was to get a degree and go off and write for Sports Illustrated. That's where my life was going to take me.
So I've never asked a reporter this, but what's it like covering a Friday night game?
Sports is very exciting. A lot of the time, I very much get into the individual play, whatever it is in the team sports, whether it's the lineman, whether it's the 130-pound lineman from Lake Preston trying to take on the 220-pound defensive guy from Wessington. I mean, those interactions always intrigue me. I loved watching the action. I loved talking to the players and coaches. Now, there were times in Brookings in particular where I can remember there'd be a 30-mile-an-hour wind and snow falling and be about 10 degrees. And I'd have to go into the bathroom in between quarters or halftime and turn the hand warmers on just to warm my hands up and stuff. So, I mean, there were times it was fairly miserable, but for the most part, the excitement of small town South Dakota or big town South Dakota to get behind their teams, the drama of the games. I mean, it just, it gets said quite a bit, but sometimes it was hard for me to believe that I was getting paid to watch and write about a game on a basketball court or football field, whatever. I mean, I just loved it.
I've always wondered how do players cope with playing sports in these miserable conditions where it's 10 degrees and 20 below wind chill?
The pro sports, they deal with it because they get $10-15 million a year to deal with it. And of course, on the
it's a good
sidelines,
incentive.
yeah, I would say so. And, on the sidelines, they have heated benches and they have all the latest technology. Now, back in the 70s, I mean, it was just cold. And fortunately, like in football, the season would end by, the first week or so in November. So they didn't have a lot of that. But yeah, I mean, I don't remember any football games ever getting called off for the weather. I think some of them were postponed because of lightning and stuff like that. But, a young kid, who is full of energy and excited about the game, they seem to be able to put the weather outside the box for them and concentrate on what they want most, and that's to do well and field of competition.
It's so inspiring, like in a society where there's so much comfort that people would choose to actually do things like that.
Yeah. I think a lot of us grow up. I know I did in Huron. I played a lot of basketball. I would go over to the grade school court and shoot baskets for hours and hours. I wonder how much kids do that today, or if social media and Xbox technology is keeping them all off the courts. But I mean, I would go to the college gym. I would go to the grade school. I had these dreams like a lot of kids, I was going to be a great basketball player. I was going to be a great football player. When I got to high school, I was too little to play football. And through junior high, there were usually about 18 kids trying out for the 7th, 8th, 9th basketball teams. They always ended up having to cut 2 or 3 players, and I was always one of the 2 or 3 that got cut. Was never quite good enough to make it. So, it was difficult then. It was hard to suffer that kind of rejection, but I figured other ways I could be involved, and one of them was through writing and covering the games.
So you love covering games. What led you to move from being a sports writer to writing about? Like, what was your position as the Argus Leader?
I was hired in the May of 1982 to be a copy editor on the sports desk, and which meant I spent a lot of the first year or two there laying out the newspaper, editing stories, creating page design and all that. Every now and then they'd let me, out of the attic, if you will, and out into the world to, cover a track event, cover a sporting event, do some kind of feature. And I started writing more as I got a couple of years into it. And at some point I had an executive editor named Dick Thien who called me into his office one day and said, "You know what? We're wasting your talents in sports." He says, you write well and you write good stories, but we should have you over on the news side writing stories about people and the things going on in their lives. So, again, roughly about 85 or 86, we had that conversation. And at that point in time, I don't want to say I'd given up on the Sports Illustrated dream, but I was starting to settle in at the Argus. I started writing some news side stories. I started really enjoying it, and I guess I could kind of see myself spending a large part of my career at the Argus Leader. So, I mean, after Dick Thien convinced me to come to news, I never looked back, and I never regretted it. And to be honest, I had some sports moments after I went to news side. In 1987, when the Twins were playing in the World Series against St. Louis.
So tight.
Yeah, the sports editor's wife was having a baby. The sports columnist had already planned a vacation down in Arizona because he didn't think the Twins were going to make it. The other senior writer's wife was sick. So they went around the newsroom and wanted to know if any news guys would volunteer to go cover the Twins in the playoffs.
And you were like, yeah, I will do it.
That's exactly what happened. I said, absolutely. And so I got to go to Detroit and Minneapolis and cover the American League Championship Series. And then they flew me off to St. Louis and Minnesota to cover the World Series. And I, that's probably as close to my Sports Illustrated dream that I would ever come, because, for a couple of weeks, I got to rub elbows with some fairly famous sports, not only athletes, but writers and people working in sports television. And so that was a tremendous experience.
So you got to go to all the games of the 1987 World Series?
Every single one of them, yeah. It was, and after the game, you're talking to Ken Herbeck, you're interviewing Jeff Reardon, you're talking to Kirby Puckett.
Kirby.
I have too many memories to recount. One of them I like to tell is I was in Detroit. I was on the field. I was trying to do a story on Sparky Anderson, who was the coach of the Detroit Tigers. He was a guy that grew up in Bridgewater, South Dakota. And I wanted to talk to him about his life growing up in South Dakota. And so we're on the field, and it's probably a half hour before game time. And all of a sudden, Brent Musburger from CBS comes over and says, "Sparky, I need to talk to you right now. We got to get this interview done." And Sparky said, "Brent, I'm talking to this gentleman from the Argus Leader. You'll have to wait. When we're done, I'll talk to you." And Brent kept kind of coming into the conversation and said, "Sparky, I need to talk to you." And Sparky kind of let him have it. He says, when I'm done talking to this gentleman, we'll talk. And finally, Brent looked at me and he says, well, do you mind if I join the conversation and maybe I can ask some questions while you're asking questions? I said, fine, Brent, come on in. So the three of us had this conversation, and it was something I'll never forget.
So Sparky would have known, he would have assumed you were a Twins fan, but
Yeah, he probably did. But he was a South Dakotan at heart, and I was a South Dakotan, so he obviously didn't hold that against me. And again,
but how polite that he said, "I'm talking to Steve now."
yep, yeah.
Wow.
And I met one of the guys. There was a famous pitcher from Baltimore, Jim Palmer, who started out in a minor league team in Aberdeen, South Dakota. And so I interviewed him, did a story on him about his time. I got to meet some of the famous ESPN guys at the time, Chris Berman and George Grand. And so, again, it was just an incredible experience, and getting to cover the games and all the drama. The World Series, the Twins won the first two games at home. They lost the next three in St. Louis. They had to come back and win two in a row, which they did. So, I mean, the drama was just spectacular.
Wow. I forgot that was, wow.
Yeah.
So this brings up, what would you say to kids growing up in Gettysburg, really small town in South Dakota Platte or whatever, about who kind of look at a life and look at the people in LA and stuff and thinks, oh, never amount to much. I'm from such a small place.
I think what I learned in my time at the Argus Leader is, again, I was like a lot of those kids. I thought if I was going to be the writer I wanted to be, I had to go to work for Sports Illustrated out in New York or Los Angeles, that I could never accomplish anything as a writer living here in South Dakota. And I found out very quickly as I worked through the years that wasn't true, that the newspaper I was at sent me off to some incredible places to do stories. I've been to Africa, I've been to Israel, I covered stories in Los Angeles and Oregon and Florida, places that had some kind of South Dakota hook to them. But I went to all those places. And I also discovered, as a writer, that there are a lot of tremendous stories right here in our backyards in those small towns that were very compelling, and were as compelling as anything I could write in the big city. And so, I would tell young people not to sell themselves short, that they have the talents to be whatever they want to be, but that they don't necessarily have to leave the state to practice those talents, because there's just a lot of fascinating, interesting, important things going on in our state.
Powerful. This brings up, like, when you live somewhere, it's easy to start taking it for granted and to think you know everything about the place and you've been on all the roads and stuff. How, as a journalist, how do you keep finding new interesting stories?
It's important to read, and we were fortunate at the Argus. We subscribed to all the different local newspapers in the state and weekly newspapers. So I mean, I was constantly looking for ideas in those newspapers, and I, through the years, I found a lot of great ideas. It was a difficult story to write, but I was reading my hometown Daily Plainsman in Huron one day, and there was an obituary for a gentleman or his wife, I forget which one it was, and they went out of their way in the obituary to explain that their loved one had died of alcoholism, and alcoholism was a terrible thing, and it had a terrible impact on their lives, and they would like their loved one's death to be a warning against the dangers of alcoholism. And so, and it indicated that their spouse had died earlier from alcoholism. So, I mean, you see something like that, you see that the family has gone public on something like that. Maybe there's a chance to do something educational here to warn people about the dangers of alcoholism and how it can impact others' lives. So I called this family up and you know, the mother, the surviving brother, and said, you know, you've been very public about it. Would you mind me writing about it? And maybe we can convince someone else maybe not to follow this path. And they were all for it. And so I did a series of stories about that. But, you know, a lot of times small town newspapers, I remember reading once in a small town newspaper, they were having a celebration of a guy who had survived the Titanic, the sinking of the Titanic, and had moved to a little town down in southeastern South Dakota, down by Viborg or Centerville. So I pick up a tidbit like that. You know, it was just a sentence in the paper that said, you know, so-and-so died 50 years ago. And so you go down to that community, you search out people who would remember him, who would have heard his story, and you kind of, you know, I think I did it around the time of the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic back in 2012. So, I mean, just in reading newspapers, you know, following the news, what's going on in the news. You know, there was a time in our recent history where states were talking about assisted suicide and allowing people to at the end of life, you know, move to their state, take a pill, and end their life if they wanted. Well, you know, something like that. If you're thinking as a journalist, you might say, and I did this. You know, I said, let's get a list of every doctor, every physician in the state, and let's send out a little 3-question questionnaire survey and say, you know, do you believe in the possibility of assisted suicide? Do you think it's something that we should consider in South Dakota? Why or why not? Would you be willing to talk to me about it? We sent out several thousand of these
several
surveys.
thousand.
Yeah,
Wow.
we got a list from the Medical Association of every physician in the state. We sent it out, and you know, we probably got 100, 150 responses back, and it was pretty interesting. Doctors that would have nothing to do with it, and doctors who, you know, saw why people might want to consider that kind of thing. And so it just, you know, you pay attention to the news, you read a lot, you track the other papers, all of that stuff becomes possibilities for what you end up writing about.
Debbie Bendendorf, who's a great author and podcaster, says a lot of people actually allow the geographical area to determine their value, just like social status and the like. Not true.
Oh, I think so. You know, I don't know if it's as true anymore as it used to be, because we are so connected to the world through the internet, through social media. I mean, it's kind of a funny story. I mean, I got to spend a month in Africa because Sioux Falls school children and different organizations were sending money with people, African refugees from this community that were going over trying to rebuild their homeland in South Sudan. So they were raising money here. They sent me over to see what they were doing with the money. And I met a number of wonderful African Sudanese people. And it's not uncommon now for me on a Sunday morning to get a message on Messenger from one of these guys in some obscure little village in South Sudan saying, "Hey, Steve, what you doing this morning? How's the weather back there?" I mean, so
Oh,
I mean, we are so connected that way that there was a time, I think, when, again, maybe we felt a little inferior here in South Dakota because we're this rural state. A lot of people, fly over this state. They don't ever stop. I was just down in Arizona for a couple weeks and would meet different people and would say, they would ask me where I was from, and I'd say South Dakota. And I'd say, what's your favorite memory of South Dakota? And they said, never been there, and I heard that time and time and time again. I mean, obviously we have things that should be drawing people to South Dakota, whether it's Mount Rushmore, the Badlands, our lakes and stuff like that. But I do know that once upon a time, and again, maybe when I was young, I felt the same way. I'm from South Dakota. I'm going to have a tough time competing in the real world because we're just this little hick state with a few people, and we don't have anything the big cities and the coasts have. But that's a 16 or 17-year-old's thought process. It's not, as I became in my 20s, 30s, and now my 60s, I realized that a lot of people would tell you that they're very glad that we are where we are, and that the rest of the world hasn't necessarily discovered us yet.
what would you tell someone from New York City who had never been to South Dakota to help them appreciate what the state really is like?
I would tell them that we are a very conservative state, and that's not the kind of thing that maybe would fly well in New York or in California. But I mean, it is who we are. We're very rural, hardworking people. I think to the extent that we have businesses like Citibank and others that have come to South Dakota, there's a realization that this is a very hardworking state. People really, work hard, and that they play hard. There's no question that we have a lot of great things going on, whether it's pheasant hunting, whether it's tourism. I mean, you only have to look at the Sioux Falls airport every October to see the planes coming in with people from all over to know that South Dakota has its attractions. I would tell people from anywhere that you won't be disappointed if you come to the state. There are things, the amazing thing to me, Jason, the other day, might have been yesterday, I was watching for a short period of time, Drew Carey. He's got that game show on in the morning. I can't remember the name of it, but the contestants were competing for a prize, and they were to the end of the program, and they were talking about this $30,000 prize package. And one of the items on the prize package was a 5-day stay in Rapid City, South Dakota, to see Mount Rushmore, experience the whole Mount Rushmore thing. And I have never before in a game show, they'll send them off to Florida, they'll send them to Hawaii, they'll send them to the Caribbean. This was a 5-day, all expense paid trip to Rapid City to see the Black Hills. And I said, wow, we've finally made it. We're finally a destination.
Yeah. He's on Price is Right, isn't he?
Yes, that's what it is. The Price is Right. Yeah.
How about like someone from LA is talking to you and you say you were born in Miller, South Dakota, and they're like, "What's Miller, South Dakota like?" What would you say to them?
I probably wouldn't tell them much because I was born in Miller and I lived there about 10 months, and then we moved to Gettysburg.
So what would you say to them about Gettysburg?
Well, they're little towns. They're important towns to the people that live there. They have their own economies. They have I think for the most part, whether it's Miller, Gettysburg, Huron, Garrettson, Sioux Falls, I mean, the towns are important, but it's the connections within the town when you're growing up, the people, the friends you meet, the memories you make those towns so special. We always, my parents used to joke all the time that when I was in Gettysburg and I was 3 years old, there was a little girl named Kathy Hauk that would always come down to the house and ask me to play, and they would have images of me walking away from the house holding this little girl's hand, and they always thought it was a big deal that I was friends with this girl. Well, I as I look back, I don't have a lot of memories because I was young of in Gettysburg, but I have these images of me and this little girl holding hands, and that was in an era that probably we don't experience as much anymore. Little kids able to walk around the neighborhoods holding hands. I mean, you do that in small town South Dakota. You don't necessarily worry about somebody breaking into your house at night or stealing your car. We get on these different apps in Sioux Falls, and every night somebody's posting something about somebody rummaging through their car or trying their door and stuff like that. I mean, the great thing about small town South Dakota life is there is a sense of security there and peacefulness that is missing, I think, from a lot of the larger places. And I think through the years, as our economy has grown and people have done well, I think we've had people from California, New York, a lot of places come to South Dakota because, the jobs are here, the cost of living is less, and they find out it's not a bad place to raise a family.
So backing up a little bit in our conversation, I don't want to miss this. You said when you first came to the Argus, you worked as sports editor in the copy room. What is that job like day in and day out? And I ask this because I can't imagine doing that job.
Yeah, when I started, this was back in the days before everything was done on computers. And so, I mean, some things were done on computers when I got there. A reporter, a sports person would write a story and they'd have it in the computer. I'd call the story up. I'd go through, I would correct the misspellings. I would correct the punctuation errors. I would put a headline on it. And in any newspaper, any given day, there probably in the sports section were 20, 30 stories. There were
20 or 30 stories.
Yeah,
That's a lot.
Yeah, and some of them would be locally generated. Some of them would come from national news organizations, the Associated Press, some of these. And you would decide what stories go on what page. And then once you would take a piece of paper and you would sketch out on the newspaper, okay, I want this story up here in the left-hand side. I want this big picture beside it. I would size the picture, write a cut line, another story here, another story. And then I would take it, I would push a button and the story would be sent out to the composing room. And the composing room is a room where these guys would take my diagram and they would create the diagram, the stories on a page. And when I first got there, we were just coming out of a union situation. And so the guys in the composing room were formerly union people. And so as they're putting these stories on the page, if you will, in the places where I want them, if I didn't think they had it quite right, I would start to peel it off and try to rearrange it somehow. And all of a sudden I'd have this little knife pecking at the back of my hand. And the guy said, you know what, that's not your job. You don't do that. So you just get your hands off that copy. And I would do that. I mean, they were very particular about it. And again, they came out of a union background and they were, to the degree that the union was no longer in place. I mean, they were going through transition that I think was kind of difficult for them. But, over time, you generate a rapport with these people and they get the the page together. They get the pictures where you want them. They get all the box scores in you want them. And you know, the part of the issue is, you know, you're trying to, those were in the days where you went to press, you had everything out by midnight. The first run was midnight. The second run was 1 o'clock. So you're trying to get box scores in. You're trying to get stories in. You've got deadlines to meet. It was always very hectic over the last couple hours, trying to figure out what was going where. And then they would get it all put together. An image would be taken of the page, and then it would be taken to the press room, and they would somehow or other, through their magic, print newspapers off these images of the pages we did. But I mean, you know, if you had a guy covering an amateur baseball game, you had a midnight deadline and it's 11:30 and he's still writing. I mean, there's all kinds of loud voices and nervousness and sweat rolling down your forehead.
So how do you deal with the stress of the amount of work and then this deadline getting closer and closer and closer and closer?
You know, I think over time you just kind of become hardwired. You know, the thing is, and none of us as reporters like this, but you might tell a guy coming in at 10 o'clock with a game story that I've got this slot for you. You can have 15 inches. There's no more, no less, 15 inches. Well, at 11:30, he'll turn in a story that's about 19 inches. And you know,
oh gosh,
you might try in about 10 quick minutes to edit stuff down to get there, or you might just end up cutting off the end of the story. I mean, the newspaper didn't like you to miss the deadlines. If you were supposed to be off the floor by midnight, you had to be off the floor. You couldn't be holding, you know, the problem is the papers have to get printed. They have to get bundled. The first run of papers at midnight, they're all going on trucks. People are taking them to Pierre, Watertown, Huron. They had to be able to get on the road at a certain time. So you could not be holding things up because you were slow. And I guess, you know, after a while, you know, I missed a few deadlines, but after a while, you just come to understand that I got to make that deadline, and you work hard early. You know, you get as much done early as you can, so that when 10, 11 rolls around, you're only waiting for a couple stories. But you know, yeah, it got hectic sometimes.
So it's definitely not the type of thing you can wait till the last minute to.
No, you can't wait till the last minute. And you know, there were some people that were better at that than others, and the ones that weren't great at it didn't stay very long. But you know, I guess, you know, at the point in time where they asked me to come to the news side, I had a son who was born in '82, and I was working till 1 a.m. He was at daycare at Sanford. Sanford's daycare would stay open till 1 a.m, but my son would be the only one there from 9 o'clock on till 1 a.m. And so I had to be out of there by 1. I had to pick that son up. He'd be wide awake for a couple hours when we get home. And then he'd fall asleep. I'd get an hour or two of sleep, and then he'd wake up at 7. And, you know, when the news editor asked me to come over to the news side, you know, I think at that point in time, maybe I was ready to, you know, we had another child on the way at that point. And I think I could see the writing on the wall that working on the news side and not having those late nights might be a whole lot better for my family life.
Wow. So you did the editing for a couple of years, or how long?
Yeah, you know, I was an editor out in Great Falls for 2 years, and then I was an editor at the Argus for about 3 or 4, sports editor. In fact, I became the assistant sports editor. But you know, over the last couple of years at the Argus, they were letting me write more sports, cover more sports. So you know, I started to ease my way, and I was, you know, doing some kind of investigative sports pieces. You know, whether it was the difficulty of umpiring games or something like that. You know, I got to produce some of those stories, and again, the news editor kind of, you know, they weren't necessarily game time stories. They were more an in-depth look at different sides of sport, and he liked them. And so he basically, again, after I'd been doing that for a couple of years, said, you know what, we need to have you come over to the news side. So that's what I did.
No, changing subjects drastically.
All right.
You mentioned you covered a lot of Native stories involving Native Americans. For someone who doesn't know much about the reservations, kind of what goes on in the pressures and stuff, what would you say?
You know, I was very fortunate in that. Well, I guess the beginning of the story is back in about '86 or so. This news editor that got me to come to the news side decided he wanted a comprehensive look at Native American life in South Dakota. So he brought together most of the reporters, and he sat us all down, and he divided us up into different groups. And he said, okay, I want you to look at education. I want you to look at crime. I want you to look at the economy. I want you to look at, law enforcement, all these different things. This was around Memorial Day. He said, I want you all to come back on Labor Day, 3 months later, and tell me what you got, and we'll go from there. Well, we all came back 3 months later, and all the reporters are busy people. It turned out I was about the only one that had done much work on it, and I had done some work on education on the reservation and how that worked. And so he basically told everybody else to go back to what they were doing, and he told me to produce a series on education.
Wow.
And so, I know growing up in South Dakota, I know being around people that there's this reluctance to spend time on reservations. There's a fear of violence on the reservation. There's a fear of the poverty. I may have had some of that myself, but I spent a lot of time before I started working on it, talking to Native American experts here in Sioux Falls. There was a guy at Augustana College, Martin Brokenleg from the Rosebud Reservation.
Yeah, great person.
And he really educated me well. There was a journalist out in Martin, Tim Gallego, and his wife. I spent a lot of I did a lot of preparation before I ever went out there, and then I got out there and took a very wide-ranging look at the difficulties of education. In Sioux Falls, if you have a teacher opening, you might have 10 people apply for it. On the reservation, if you have a teacher opening, you might get a half a person on average. You don't even get a whole. So it's real difficult. But in discussing the issues, the problems, the dropout rates were incredible on the reservations. I also tried to spend time finding the success stories, and I didn't want to paint this bleak picture of reservation life. I wanted to show that there were successful people on the reservation. For the most part, these are the things that went into why they were successful. And, I created a lot of friendships doing that. And I spent a lot of time, roaming the reservation, talking to a lot of people. And I became very comfortable being out there and with the connections I made. And from there, I did one series after another. There has been and is a long-standing conversation. The U.S. government, Supreme Court decided that the tribes in South Dakota were entitled. It was at the time like $125 million. They were entitled to that from the U.S. government for the taking of the Black Hills, the illegal taking of the Black Hills. I did a big series where I spent a lot of time talking to Native Americans about, okay, what do you want? You want the Black Hills back, or would the money be better? And we delved into that issue quite deeply with tribal people from all kinds of tribes. I did a series on crime. I looked at the incarceration rate of Native Americans versus the white South Dakota, and how disparate that was and why that was, and focused on a number of different cases that really showed how Native Americans really get the bad part of sentencing when it comes to crime. And I did enough of that at one point the chairman of the Rosebud tribe invited me out to do a series on suicide. The reservations in South Dakota had some of the highest suicide rates in the world, and they, yeah, and they were calling emergencies on these reservations to deal with it, and they were asking for help on how to deal with it. And I mean, I went out and I interviewed all kinds of families who had lost children to suicide. I interviewed kids who had considered it and tried it. A lot of those stories, excuse me, I mean, cover very, very serious topics. But again, in the course of meeting people like that, I also tried to get on the reservation and do stories about, families that were planting community gardens to provide produce and stuff for everybody. A lot of those neat things going on.
What was one of your favorite success stories?
The gardens was one I really liked a lot. I did one on a school down on the Yankton Reservation where they were teaching the language to little children. They were trying to preserve the language, and it was fun to sit there and watch the little kids listening and speaking. We have Spanish immersion schools here in Sioux Falls. These were like Lakota and Dakota immersion schools on the reservations. I thought those were very fantastic. Excuse me, I met a woman out in Pine Ridge, Tiny DeCory was her name, who was working with youth, profiled her. I met a medicine man, a holy man, Rick Two Dogs, and got to spend time with him talking about the native traditions and how important they are to their people. So, I mean, all those stories, I think the native people, I mean, they get tired of, they call it helicopter journalism, where somebody from the East Coast or wherever will helicopter in, do about 12 interviews about how bad things are, and then go back and write a long piece on how terrible the reservations are. I mean, there's a lot to be said for the difficulty of life on reservations, but there are a lot of great people there. And I took my son out there. There was a little baby whose family was killed at the Battle of Wounded Knee, and one of the cavalry soldiers took her off to California after the battle to raise her. Don't think she had a great life. She died there, and they managed to repatriate her bones, bring them back to Wounded Knee, and in a very beautiful ceremony, buried her in the mass grave with the rest of the victims of Wounded Knee. I took my 8-year-old son out with me. We covered the ceremony. It was a beautiful ceremony. The keeper of the sacred pipe conducted it, and excuse me, those were neat stories to be able to tell.
Wow. Sounds like such a profoundly powerful story.
Yeah. And one of the last ones I did was the chairman that had me write about suicide said, the problem with your white readership is they just don't know what it's like to grow up Indian. They don't know what it's like to live on a reservation. He says, you should come out and just from birth until adulthood, talk about what it is like to grow up on a reservation. And I did that, and it was one of the neatest things I ever did. I focused on three young women, one of whom from Pine Ridge, who had a wonderful family. She graduated from high school. She went off to Dartmouth. She did very well for herself. One of the young women was from Lower Brule. She was 15. She had a child. She was kind of torn between the drugs and the violence and wanting to better herself. And she was kind of caught in the middle of all that. And then the third one was a young woman from the St. Francis area who was murdered by a young man who had been her friend her whole life growing up. And so, I kind of contrasted and compared you know, what gets a girl to Dartmouth? You know, what are the values and the successes on the reservation
Wow.
that make that happen? What are the challenges that a girl that's pregnant at 15, you know, the gangs and all that, and then you know, with the girl from St. Francis, you know, what are the dangers? You know, how dangerous is it to grow up on the reservation? And
Wow.
why are those dangers there, and what are they doing? And I mean, it ended up doing well. We ended up getting an award for it from the Harvard University, which was kind of nice confirmation that this was an important story to do and an
Wow.
important story to tell. And they liked the balance of it, that it wasn't just a helicopter journalism looking at all the bad, but that we focused on good, bad, and everything in between.
How nice to not only do that series, but to get the rewards or the award. So you know that the series is being appreciated beyond beyond South Dakota. That's really cool.
Yeah, you know, that's one of the things that makes journalism fun. You know, I had done a series a lot of years ago about a cult that left Sioux Falls, moved down to Florida, wait for the end of time. It was called the End Time Ministries, and they were one of their issues was they didn't believe in medical care for their children, so they were leaving children behind in graves who could have lived if they got medical treatment. And one of the neat things about that series is that after it ran, our state legislature looked at the idea of changing or altering what's called a religious shield law. And the religious shield law says that, you know, if you choose to treat your children certain ways because of your religious beliefs, in the past you were allowed to do that. Now, because of this series, they were looking at changing the law to say, okay, if it's possible for you to treat your children from a religious standpoint, we'll allow that, but you have to have a public health person come in and look at that child and see if healing through prayer is going to be enough to save this child, or if they need medical. And so when you do a series like that and you get the legislature to act on it, you know, that's kind of the reward for me for being in this profession,
Wow.
that you motivate people to action.
So that reporting literally directly correlates to saving lives.
Saving lives, yeah. You know, a second, I was on the desk one night and I was laying out the newspaper for the Sioux Empire section, and I got a call that a friend of mine at the penitentiary, he was an assistant warden, had been fired. And so I called him up at home and I said, "What's the deal here? I hear you've been fired." And he said, "Yeah." He was applying to be the next warden. The current warden was retiring, and he had been interviewed for the job. And he had brought up some concerns during the interview that at one point in time, in the recent time of the prison, there was a concern that inmates had hacksaw blades and weapons in the prison and were a danger to the officers and the school staff and all that. And apparently the warden, it's within his right to do whatever he can to protect the staff. He was told by one of the inmates that inmate would get the hacksaw blades and the weapons out in exchange for marijuana. And so the warden of the penitentiary said, "Okay, we'll bring you marijuana if you bring us hacksaw blades and the weapons," which, I mean, he was concerned about the safety. I understand that, but you wonder who would bring marijuana and give marijuana to inmates in a penitentiary. Well, he told me this story, and so I called up the board of charities, which was involved in doing the interviews to hire the next warden. And the guy I got a hold of said, he's a disgruntled guy. He's not going to get the job. You know, he was bringing up stuff that's not true. So we fired him. And so after I interviewed him, I knew the associate warden for security. I called him at home and I said, "Assistant warden, are you trading hacksaw blades for marijuana at the South Dakota Penitentiary? And the guy, to his credit, why he said this, I'll never know, but he said, yes, we are. And I said, why in the world
Wow.
would you do that? And he said, it was a security issue. We were trying to protect, staff and all that. Well, I get off the phone from him, and literally 5 minutes later, for the one and only time in my life, the governor of South Dakota calls me on the phone at the Argus Leader. And he says, you're doing a story on this guy that we fired because he was making up stuff about problems at the penitentiary. And I said, I am, Warden. I said, but before you go any further, I should tell you that I talked to the associate warden just a few minutes ago, and he confirmed to me that it's true. And, there was about 10 seconds of silence on the phone. And then the governor says, he confirmed it. And I said, yes, he did. And he says, I'll have to call you back. And he, in fact, ended up, it became a big deal. It blew up, and they had to do this investigation, and they ended up, literally, the attorney general had to investigate it. They ended up indicting the warden. They ended up indicting several other people in the penitentiary, and Governor Janklow, who was in private practice at the time, defended the warden. And again, there was in statute a statute that said that the warden could do anything he wanted to protect the prison. But in the aftermath of that, there was a lot of changes in the Department of Corrections. They hired a secretary. They moved people out of positions. And again, there was a press conference with the governor on a Friday after that. And somebody asked him in the press conference, when's the first time you knew you had a problem at the penitentiary with this? And the governor, to his credit, said, when I talked to the reporter from the Argus Leader, that was the first time I knew it. And talk about a confirming moment for a journalist in South Dakota.
Wow.
It was fantastic.
Wow.
And they made a lot of changes. And again, I like to think, because of the work we did in journalism, that whether it was the Religious Shield law, whether it was the penitentiary, that our work as being watchdogs made things better in the state.
Linda Clement says, I do not want this podcast to end, Jason. Please invite Steve back.
Be happy to.
Awesome. So speaking of being watchdogs and all the good that can do, briefly, what do you see as the future of journalism?
That's a good question. I think it's interesting that the newspaper I'm at, and at one time there was probably 50 or 60 people in the newsroom. Now there's about 7 or 8 or 9. They're not very many.
Wow.
That I hope it continues, and I hope the Gannett, puts the resources in to keep that newspaper going. But it's interesting that a lot of former journalists now have branched out and are doing their own, I guess, for the most part, online journalism. The former publisher and editor of the Argus, Jack Marsh and Randall Beck, have started a thing called South Dakota News Watch. I think they fund it through sponsorships, through yearly membership drives and all that. But they put out a lot of compelling journalism that is available to television and stations and newspapers to use. I've got a couple buddies, Joe Sneevy and Jonathan Ellis, who've got their own, again, online journalism, Dakota Scout. There's another online group called South Dakota Searchlight. They're doing government and political coverage. I do some freelance writing for a woman named Jody Schwan, who used to work at Kello. And she works she worked at the Argus. She does business reporting. She does human interest stories that I write for Pigeon 605. So I think, in large part, I don't know how many of the journalism graduates will be going to newspapers. I suspect some of them will. I suspect if these offshoots, online publications become big enough, and again, they fund themselves with sponsors, I think, more than they do with subscriptions. And people pay a certain amount to have them produce what they produce. They get bigger. I could see maybe journalists gravitating to some of those organizations, and I can see that as becoming the future of South Dakota.
So you see journalism not disappearing, but evolving and adapting to different forms.
Absolutely. That's society needs the watchdogs. They need people. I don't have any issues at all with our current governor, but I wish she would sit down in front of our reporters and other reporters and talk about what she's doing and why she's doing it, instead of just operating in her own little bubble. I mean, we only end up living in the dark when we don't shine a light on the things going on in
We
our
only
government.
end up living in the dark when we don't shine a light on the
Right.
things going on.
Right.
Powerful.
Yeah.
I ask all my guests this question to close out usually. I talk about the power of doing our imperfect best, and to me it means more each day. It means envisioning the best we want in our lives, to me. But then when the imperfect happens, the mistakes and stuff, instead of being incapacitated by those or ignoring them, doing our imperfect best means learning from them and moving forward and becoming better and becoming more what we want our lives to be. What does doing your imperfect best mean to you, Steve Young?
Well, Jason, one of my favorite lines all the time as I deal with people is, I'm simply imperfectly human. I'm not perfectly human. I'm imperfectly human. I've got a long history of making mistakes, and to be honest, I made a lot of mistakes in journalism. I can't tell you the number of times that I would get a phone call from Bill Janklow at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning, just screaming at me for doing something I shouldn't, that he thought I was wrong. And I was never smart enough to argue with him. I mean, if he said I was wrong, I guess my knees shook and I believed him. But I learned from that. I learned, to be more diligent, to not just check something 3 times, but to check it 4 or 5 times. One of the famous journalism mantras is, if your mother tells you she loves you, you check it out. In other words, don't believe anything on face value. You check it out. And the thing about journalism and journalism under pressure is that you do make mistakes. And I think what I've learned from being imperfectly human is you always correct those mistakes. You always admit them. You don't hide behind some kind of cloak of, well, I don't agree with you. You're wrong. And I'm just not going to discuss it with you. No, if I'm wrong, if I'm imperfect in what I've done, I own up to it. And I've written a lot of corrections in my life. But in doing that, I strive to not make the same mistake again, and to do everything in my power to be better the next time. And really, I'm always going to be imperfect, but I can be better. I can be imperfect and I can be better. And I think every single day in what I do, I strive to be better. And if I can go to bed at night thinking, you know what, I did that better than I did the last time, then I can live with myself.
That's really good. I can be imperfect and I can be better.
Yep.
It's really good. I like that a lot. It's been fascinating talking with you, Steve. I look forward to our next conversation. Thanks so much for your time.
I do too. Thank you, Jason.
I love doing my podcast so much. If we don't ask the people around us about the amazing things in their lives, we can just make assumptions or just assume things are interesting. ask your friends, ask your family members, ask the people you know professionally about the things that interest them, the things that are important to them, and then listen for the answers. And at least for me, that's adds so much interest to my own life. Hearing other people tell great stories like today, Steve. Wow, could talk to him for the next 5 hours. That's so amazing. So anyway, thanks for tuning in live, or thanks for watching this replay. Your support means so much to me. Please comment or ask a question if you want, and have a great week. Next week, oh my gosh, talk to Hill Smith, who has so much to say about learning life and professional development, and finding the courage and the skill to speaking in public. So please tune in for that. Until next time, make it until next time I cough, make it awkwardly awesome week. Thanks for tuning in.